keyword research tells you what people are searching for. What is corporate wellness or what is a podcast? But only audience research will tell you who is searching for that.
Introducing Recorded Content, a podcast for small, scrappy B2B marketing teams who want to get the most out of podcasting. In each episode, we capture stories from industry experts and podcasters. Listen in and uncover what it takes to launch, run, and grow a successful B2B podcast. Check out and subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Let's jump in.
Hey, I'm Tristan. I'm the co-founder of Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. This show is brought to you by my company, Motion. We are a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers. One of the major components of developing a solid podcast strategy is understanding your audience's wants and needs. And it's important to understand the competition too. But what's the best way to understand your audience and their behaviors? How do you identify your customers' favorite podcasts? How do you know what online resources they turn to for help? And how can you find out what inspires your customers? In this episode, I have Amanda Natividad. She's the VP of Marketing at SparkToro. SparkToro helps entrepreneurs, marketers, and product developers uncover the publications and people that influence their target audiences. And in this conversation, Amanda helps us understand how you can take a systematic approach to audience research and uncover your audience's behaviors before you launch your company's podcast. So one of your best tweets that in my opinion, is when you talked about you're lazy when you throw a big party. And so one of the things that you suggested was to make one signature drink, put it in a punch bowl versus mixing up all these individual drinks. So if I'm hosting something over the holidays, which we typically do with like 20 to 30 adults, what should I put in the punch bowl?
Ooh, okay. Since we're coming upon the holiday season, I would suggest you consider some kind of mulled wine that you keep in a slow cooker. It's festive, it's fun, it serves itself, and you make it all in the whole big slow cooker, and people can just serve themselves throughout the party, and it's a fresh drink.
Interesting. Never even heard about that. So
This
is going to send me down some rabbit hole later on.
It will. I haven't made mulled wine or something like it in quite a while, but it involves like cinnamon, maybe some cloves, probably involves bourbon, but it's just like this delicious, like warm cider-ish tasting drink.
Okay. Very nice. Well, that might be on the agenda for us, and I'll hit you up later with a specific recipe or something. Well, now that we got the important stuff out of the way, want to talk a lot about audience research today, especially how we connect audience research to podcasting and really, being at SparkToro, that's obviously a big piece. What you enable agencies to do and other companies is research their audience and have that like drive some of the decisions that they make. But I wanted to just understand a little bit about, you've been a marketer for a while. You've created a lot of content. I think the first time that we met, you were a growth machine on your podcast and you were running marketing there. So in your opinion, just with all the content that you've created over time as a marketer, what is the hardest part about audience research from your perspective?
I think the hardest part is really just doing it effectively, right? Because I think traditionally with audience research, and maybe we take a step back here, like audience research is researching your audience, right? Which is usually a mix of a bunch of different things. It can come in the form of focus groups, maybe some market research, running surveys. Could even come in part of it, being a part of what can inform it is even just traditional keyword research strategy, right? Understanding what keywords people are searching for. I think the hardest part of audience research is putting all these things together and understanding what it is that you're looking for and then doing something with it. I think that's really the hardest part. And I think the other thing is there isn't really one way to do audience research, right? If you say, hey, let's go do some market research, people know that involves some kind of mix of surveys and, talking to people and all that stuff. But when you say audience research, I don't think there's an agreed upon method that people think, oh yes, audience research, I'm on it. I think that usually will result in people kind of scratching their heads like, I think I got it.
And so where did you, before SparkToro existed, I mean, where did you traditionally start if you're tasked to doing some research about your audience? I mean, what are some of the ingredients that you use to make that happen?
So before SparkToro, which is an audience research tool, and we'll get into that later, I started by consuming what my audience consumed. And I think the best example that I have that, I think is more broadly applicable to anyone listening is, when I worked at Fitbit on the B2B team, right? We marketed to HR and benefits leaders. We, could have gone the traditional keyword research route, right? Which would have been looking like finding that popular search terms were things like what is corporate wellness? What is a physical activity program? Physical activity and employees, right? Like those are probably things that some HR and benefits leaders are searching for. However, I sort of instinctively knew but if you're an HR person or benefits leader, you already know what that is. Like you're not searching for what is corporate wellness. You're thinking about, well, how can I take this program to the next level? How can I realize the value of my investment? Or how can I better engage my employees in this program? You're thinking about all these how things. And those were things that I don't think at the time, at least, were really covered by keyword research. And so I thought, well, if I'm going to write or create content for this audience, I really need to meet them where they are, understand where they're coming from, consume the content they're consuming, and then try to help them figure out what's next. So in some initial audience research, I think my starting point was from this PR agency that we worked with, who said that in a survey of a couple hundred HR and benefits leaders, they found that people read Psychology Today and Entrepreneur Magazine. And so that was fascinating to me because if you asked me what do HR and benefits leaders read? I'd be like, I don't know, Human Resource Executive Magazine, which is, I think, partly true. But Psychology Today and Entrepreneur unlocked a couple things for me. It unlocked the idea that, they really see themselves as in the business of people, and they really care about social psychology and driving motivational change. And so once I, got to those resources and started reading Psychology Today and Entrepreneur magazines, then I started to think, I think, more in line with our target audience. And then I was thinking, maybe for our conference coming up, we should have a couple of researchers at the forefront of social psychology to talk about driving motivational change. And those were some of the things that ended up being a lot more successful from the overall sort of content marketing side.
Got it. So you almost try to put yourself in the shoes of your customer and just try to think about if I'm trying to get more information on this, where would I go? And then you found some surprises along the way, and that helped shape some of your thoughts there. And then I'm wondering, because you have a blog post out there, which I wanted to ask about next. And I'm sure you remember it. It was released a couple months ago, but you talked about the definition of a content audience, which I think is interesting because I believe a lot of people start with their customer persona and they don't really think about these extra layers that are around it. And you actually have the content audience, let me get this right, as a combination of the buyer or customer persona, the amplifier persona, and the attention persona. So can you walk me through what those three layers are?
Yeah. So, we obviously have that classic buyer persona, the people who would ideally buy our product. And then you have your amplifier persona, which represents the people who might amplify your content and or your brand. So an amplifier might be a creator in your niche, could be a reporter, could be an analyst, right? Those are all potential amplifiers. And then in your broadest sort of audience, you have the attention persona, which I define as people who pay attention or people who might pay attention to you. And so, of course, this can include customers. It can include creators in your niche. It can include reporters. But then more broadly, it might include reporters in the mainstream, or it might include potential investors or VCs. People like that who are generally paying attention to maybe the landscape or to your industry, who might end up, who could be in some way influenced by your content. So I think more marketers should be thinking more holistically about that and not just thinking about their buyer personas.
Yeah, I really like that a lot. And that's something we when I read this blog post and you shared it on Twitter and kind of your thoughts there, but I kind of backed into like what we do. And I never really thought about it in those three segments before, but it is something that we were intentional about with a lot of the content we produce. And then even suggest with our clients is, you have your piece of content, but then you have to figure out, distribution is a word, but like, what does that really mean? If I want to actually distribute this authentically or organically through channels that people are actually paying attention to. And something that you mentioned here with Amplify and even the attention persona, you talked about it as like a person or people. So do you think about it in where an amplifier is a person versus, distributing through a brand or some paid mechanism like that? Like, how do you think about those three buckets there?
Yeah. So if I'm thinking about the amplifier persona, I'm thinking about who are the people that are most likely to amplify my content in a meaningful way. And so for anybody, it can be different, but the one that I feel like is most applicable to B2B would be probably niche newsletter writers, like people maybe who are writing B2B marketing newsletters or, any other kind of newsletter. But I think about those people because those are the people who have some kind of captive audience, whether it's like 1,000 subscribers, or if you're Lenny Rachitsky, it's like 250,000 subscribers, right? But those are people with a captive audience with an email address who are writing more thoughtful, maybe long form content, who are paying attention to trends and sort of putting all these things together in a really, really thoughtful and meaningful way. So those are the people that I pay attention to as potential amplifiers. And so I think about it like, okay, if I'm creating this piece of content, how might a potential amplifier amplify it, right? Like maybe would they use this as a proof point in something they're already writing? Would they just read it? Like maybe they would just read it and find it interesting and maybe they would include it in a link roundup. Or in general, maybe if even you're just starting from the beginning, right, of even just the creation phase, then you can start to plan really early and think about, well, how can this content that I'm creating support this amplifier in their journey, right? And so if you're thinking about how you're supporting your amplifiers, you're thinking about what are their top line goals or their needs. Now, I think most amplifiers have the same general goals of like growing their audience, increasing loyalty with their existing audience. Maybe the third one is making money, maybe. I kind of put that as the last one because it's like you could pay someone to promote your content, right? But usually the goal is not to do that, right? Usually your goal is to create content so good people want to amplify it. So if you're thinking about how does this potential amplifier that I want to work with, how can my content help them grow their audience or help them build trust or loyalty with their existing one? So then you can start to think about things like, well, maybe I'm going to create a report on the industry that will help serve as a proof point for something they already do. Like maybe they're already going to write some kind of deep dive article on product management. And maybe I have some research that can help support that. So I would think about it like that.
So it seems like when you're talking about the amplifier and the attention personas, it's almost like a collaboration versus like a paid approach. Is that how you typically view it, or like how do you weigh those things, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, that's how I view it because I guess I don't come from the world of like paying influencers and securing those kinds of sponsorships. I've done them before. I've done that in the past, but that just kind of isn't my world. My world is more of creating content. So I tend to think about it through the lens of, well, how can I create content that enables a collaborative relationship or that can be mutually beneficial in a way that doesn't have to involve exchanging money?
And back to something that you talked about, in order to find like these pockets of people that might be able to support these different personas, you mentioned that a lot of times, and you've done it, I've done it, where a lot of our research starts with keyword research. What are people searching for? And then, where do we end up from there? How does audience research differ from keyword research?
I think about it like keyword research tells you what people are searching for. What is corporate wellness or what is a podcast? But only audience research will tell you who is searching for that. So you can get you can get the data that says there are 700 searches per month on what is a podcast, but you have no idea who is searching for that, right? And so I think it would be unwise to create a whole content strategy based on what is podcast content, because if your target audience is B2B decision makers who want to launch their own podcast, they already know what a podcast is.
Mhm.
They're not searching for what is a podcast. They're searching for things like, I don't know, how to prove ROI of a podcast, or, best microphones to buy or best microphones under $300 to buy for a podcast, right?
Yeah.
The stuff that's a better signal of them making a decision to do the thing versus generally exploring or understanding a thing.
Got it. And I know you've done, since we're talking about podcasts, we can shift to that a little bit, where I know you've done a podcast before. I mean, that's how we first met. I showed up on Growth Machines podcast that you were hosting. How can audience research play a role in driving your podcast strategy in your opinion?
Yeah. So I feel like, okay, I think podcast data in general has just been notoriously difficult to find, right? Like, you never know how many downloads a podcast gets, or like if it's truly influential in your niche. But one thing about SparkToro is that it helps you find those influential podcasts. So when I think about podcast strategy, my mind kind of splinters off to like 5 different directions. Like, what can you do with that? You can do a lot with this. So if you are launching a podcast, and let's say you're launching a sort of interview style podcast, and one thing, of course, for one, you want to get super clear on your own goals. Like, why are you launching a podcast? What do you hope to gain out of it? And then figuring out the right strategy for you, or the right content strategy for yourself, right? Like, maybe it's you want to do a interview style podcast with B2B decision makers. Cool. And then from there, you can do the audience research to understand which guests you should pitch. And then, you can use a tool like SparkToro, but not to make this a commercial for that. You can, if you do audience research on understanding, who are the right decision makers in your niche, how can you support them? What are some of the goals that they have? How can you make this all mutually beneficial? Then you can start to pitch guests on things like, hey, we'd love to have you on the show. My show reaches, a couple hundred people in this B2B tech space specifically, which I know is also your target audience. So if you come on the show and talk about this, topic about IT or whatever it might be, I think we can reach the right people here with your message. So I think showing that nice confluence of having the right audience, being aligned on messaging and aligned on that vision will help you create a really compelling sort of pitch strategy to get guests on your show.
Yeah, so guests are definitely a big piece. And then I was wondering what your thoughts were. And this is why when I reached out to you, we are working on creating something called a podcast benchmark analysis. I mean, we're playing with the name. We're working with that a little bit, but it's like basically a benchmark competitive analysis. And I wanted to kind of pull in competition a little bit and see if we can talk through that, because I think from what I've seen of SparkToro, I think it can help, audience research can help get over like this hurdle of wanting to stand out or creating something a little different with a podcast. And that's what we're working with a lot of our customers when they work with Motion, and they're like, I know I want to do a podcast because it's going to help drive a lot of content that we have, but I'm trying to understand how it can be a little bit different than what's already out there, different than what our audience is already listening to or watching. And that's what we're trying to do. How do you factor in just viewing the competition and trying to find some of that free space to play in?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a thing that, I think more podcast hosts would be wise to do, which is to figure out your unique positioning statement. So thinking about the one thing you do uniquely different. And I think what's really important about a positioning statement as your vision for the show is to not be afraid to turn off some people, right? Because if you have a show that's like, we do a show about talking to B2B leaders, it's like, okay, that's a lot of shows, but what's different about yours?
Yeah, and I think what what the research can tell you too, and this is like the approach we often take is find out what's there. Like in most of it, I think the biggest issue is it's surface level, and you just don't get to that level deeper with the details. And from a branded podcast standpoint, I think that's the biggest opportunity. A lot of people want to lean on a gimmick, whether it's eating hot wings while you're discussing the same surface level stuff. Like that doesn't really help anyone. It's still just talking about the same high level material that everyone else is, but maybe it's with a spicy drink or spicy food. That's just not that much different in my opinion. I think what they can do with research, if they get a sense of what the landscape is out there. Okay, so here's what customers have available to them. Let's look at the episode titles. Let's look at the show descriptions. Like where, what is the level of detail there and what is missing? Where are the gaps? And that's where you can kind of fall into and you can find that spot. And then that's where you can connect with your audience at a detailed level versus just like a gimmick. Because I know in some blog posts that you all have written, you talk about finding those gaps in information with the research, and that can help you as a brand. Like, where do you see that playing in?
One obvious answer for me is looking in SparkToro for some of those topics. So if you do a search in SparkToro about your audience, you can see text insights, which would be the phrases or words that they talk about publicly online. So that could be a starting point, right? Like if you're finding that in your audience, a lot of people are talking about email marketing, that could give you a sign that maybe that's something to include in a positioning for your show, or maybe it's at least a topic that you make sure you cover. So I think that's one piece. I think the other thing is really just, I think when you're thinking about the overall theme or like what is your show about, I think really important is to talk to your audience or talk to your potential audience about what they want or like why it is they care about you. Like what's unique about yourself that maybe you don't see because you're too close to it, right? But maybe talking with customers about what do they find that's so unique about you, about what you do, and then trying to tap into that and turn that thing into a show.
And so if I wanted to start my audience research strictly for a podcast strategy, like where do I physically go in SparkToro? I mean, let's get into that detail. I have a subscription with SparkToro. Do I plug in like the most common keyword that my website ranks for, or like my category name? Like where would you start?
Yeah, I would start with search terms that best exemplify your audience. So this could be my audience uses these words in their profile, and it might be like marketing director, or maybe it's like show host, podcast host, things like that. The words that people would use publicly to self-identify, right? And you ideally want this to be specific enough, like podcast host, right? You could try a search term like father, mother, but those are probably going to be too broad because there are lots of moms and dads in the world. So that's one starting point. You can also search by, if your website gets a lot of traffic, you can search by my audience frequently visits the website, mywebsite.com. Or what you can do is pop over to similarweb.com, type in your website, and then you'll see a list, like maybe 4 or 5 or so other websites that represent the people who visit your website. They also visit those 4 or 5 other websites. So this doesn't necessarily mean competition, right? Mm-hmm. But it does mean a shared audience. So in the case of SparkToro, which is kind of interesting, is SparkToro is an audience research tool. I recently searched for us in SimilarWeb and saw that a lot of other people in our audience also go to Ahrefs.com. Ahrefs is not a competitor, right? They make a keyword research tool or a suite of keyword research and SEO tools. Mm-hmm. So great example of shared audience, not competition, and look, great product, right? So then you could also search for my audience frequently visits the website, Ahrefs.com. Right. And then you get a sense of, okay, this is my audience. Here are some of their online behaviors. And that's where you see things like demographics, topics they talk about publicly online, social accounts they follow, podcasts they listen to, other websites they frequent, and YouTube channels they subscribe to. Oh, and now Reddits that they frequent or subreddits that they frequent. So this gives you this overall holistic view of what your audience is doing publicly online.
Well, I guess what would your advice be if someone is taking that approach. They plug in a job title. Do they keep going down different rabbit holes and then off SparkToro, like, go off site and see what's on that particular website that was referenced, and then coming back and looking at it? Like, how do you navigate back and forth to figuring out how to use that information?
Yeah, so I would say, let's say you're starting from scratch, right? So, running a couple of searches to best understand that starting point, right? The social accounts, press that people are influenced by, podcasts they listen to, and then creating some news feeds for yourself. So maybe you'll start with social accounts. Then I would create a Twitter list of maybe the top 50 or 100 social accounts that are influential in this niche. Follow along with this content just to see what are some of the topics or trends that are top of mind for this audience. And then from there, I would probably pick out a couple of podcasts. I might not necessarily pick the top 3 just because, SparkToro will surface the most popular content.
Yeah.
So sometimes the most popular content will reach the broadest audience, right? So maybe if you run a search and you see that your audience, most of them listen to Joe Rogan, right? That's pretty broad and doesn't really tell you a whole lot.
Yeah.
Maybe you want to listen to it, maybe not. But I would pick out a sampling of podcasts that both are influential, but also seem kind of in line with my own goals or my overall content strategy, because that would give me good sources of influence for myself. Because then maybe I'll go down the list and see lower down, it's oh, this audience also listens to Masters of Scale, right? That podcast. And it's okay, that's a popular show, but it's also niche enough where not everybody listens to that, right?
Yeah.
So I would listen to that and get that baseline over the course of maybe days or weeks. What is influential, the topics that my audience is thinking about and how they think. And then from there, I would think about how to make decisions on my show. Because then maybe I'll think about oh, I've been listening to, Masters of Scale a lot recently, and Reid Hoffman talks about these topics a lot. You know what he's not talking about? He's not talking about this other thing that I really want my show to be about, right? Then I think these will kind of inevitably give you ideas for starting points for your own content.
It's good that you're mentioning that, because that's been our initial approach with the list of podcasts that are provided. We can go down past 25 or 30 on the list and actually start to get 30 to 100, down in more of the details. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we're doing with this competitive benchmark that we've started with is we're actually listening to the podcast and analyzing what is their format, what is the approach. Do they have a really famous host in the industry that's well known, or is it someone inside the organization that is driving the conversations? And I think you can get the pulse on what your audience is listening to that way too, just by analyzing the landscape of the different shows. And that can maybe drive some of the decisions that you make there, whether it's just setting the show up or even on an individual episode basis. So that's it. I wanted to get into, there was a blog post that Rand Fishkin wrote that talked about how to use SparkToro for episodic content, which I thought was really good. And that's really what sparked this conversation, why I wanted to bring you on, because I think this research can be valuable for not only setting up the strategy, but using this on a recurring basis to drive some of the information for your show. So there were 3 areas that Rand mentioned SparkToro could help you with that episodic content, which number 1 was help with planning episodes, 2 was determining a distribution plan, and then 3 was planning the outreach and amplification. So that kind of ties a lot in with those 3 audience segments that you set up front. So how, in your opinion, could you get to the detail? How could you actually craft an episode title that resonates with your audience based on the research that SparkToro provides? How would you connect those dots?
Yeah, I mean, I would search I would pay close attention to the text insights in SparkToro, because those will be representative of the words, phrases that your audience has been talking about online for the past 2 months or so, past quarter or so. So those would be, what's top of mind for them. And also just thinking about, it also just comes down to good copywriting, right? Active voice, punchy words, easy to understand statements that you can just glance at and reflexively know what it means. I think that's a huge part of it too.
Yeah. And what about revisiting research? Because there was something referenced in that same post was, and I'll pull the quote here. It just mentioned your marketing campaign shouldn't depend on a static PowerPoint slide that's updated once every 2 years. So 2 years is way too long, and you need to actually revisit audience research. So what's your recommendation as far as how to use this on a recurring basis?
Yeah. I mean, I would look at this stuff every couple months or so. Like, I don't think a lot of this changes day to day, right? It's
Yeah.
not that dynamic. But it also, and I think there are probably also some top line stuff that might not even change yearly, right? Like maybe a highly influential podcast today is probably going to still be highly influential next year. So there's that. I would look at the things that are more on a recurring basis. I would look at the things that are a little bit more dynamic or ephemeral, like social media accounts, right? Those can change a little bit faster. The text insights, because topics change from over each quarter. Yeah.
And what if, since you've been at SparkToro, I mean, you've rolled out different features and so forth, what's been the biggest underutilized feature in your opinion that exists in SparkToro, but it's just not like, I don't know, readily available, or people don't even know it exists, but it's really powerful? What do you think there?
I'm going to say, even though it's new, it's our Reddit data, right? I think Reddit data is pretty difficult for people to get. And I think part of it is, or I think it's largely because a lot of marketers don't really know what to do with Reddit, right?
Yeah.
Because Reddit is such a uniquely special social media platform, right? Most accounts are anonymous. The most popular answers tend to be the ones that are incredibly thorough and cover a lot of nuance. So I think Reddit is a pretty intelligent community of people who they care about all these details, which is really unique and pretty special about it. And if anyone is seeming to be overly self-promotional, immediately you'll get downvoted or banned, or your comment will get
Yeah.
moderated. So it's a really special platform, right? I personally like it most for reading about discussions on movies or TV shows. And I rarely participate, but I read all of the comments, and
Yeah.
it feels to me like being a fly on the wall of my smart friends' conversations. And I'm like, man, these people are so funny. They're so witty. That's how I like to use it. As a marketer, even I don't really use it that much. So what's really special about SparkToro's use of Reddit is the way that you can see the most influential and most popular subreddits in any given niche. So here's where they'll find things like, oh, if, maybe people who self-identify as marketers, one extremely popular, actually, I got to do the search for it because I don't know it off the top of my head. But, you'll find subreddits that you might not have realized could have ever been super influential.
Yeah, there's a subreddit
yeah.
for everything that you
There's
can
ones for
imagine.
everything, and you'll get a whole list of them too.
Yeah.
Wait, I'm going to search for it really quick. Okay. Okay, so if you are a marketing director, you self-identify as a marketing director, running a SparkToro query for this will show that some of the most popular subreddits are, stocks. Oh, penny stocks. One called a subreddit called anti-work, people who want to end work. Right? Like these are interesting, right? Like the GameStop stock community is still pretty popular here. I'm pretty surprised to see there's a lot of personal finance interest in the marketing director community. Like I wouldn't have known that.
Yeah, that is interesting. And what prompted SparkToro to include Reddit data? Like, is there something customers were asking for? Or
yeah, like customers were asking about it, were curious about it, and we really wanted to make sure that we have, or that we're creating the path for having the best coverage of social media platforms with respect to audience research.
And with all the content you create, Amanda, at SparkToro, I mean, how are you personally using it to drive some of the decisions that you all make with what to prioritize as far as, with events or written pieces? Like, how does it work for you?
I still use it a lot for the text insights because I'm always looking for content ideas, and that helps me get a baseline for, okay, I know like 10% of my audience really cares about marketing strategy. Like, you know, that's helpful to me to understand, like, okay, maybe I should think a little bit more. Maybe I should zoom out a little bit and not think just about content marketing, right? And think more about marketing in general. So that's helpful to me for that. I usually can find some new social accounts to follow because, I'm always looking for new sources of information. And then even for the podcast stuff, because then I'll find like I'll find that there are still a lot of SEO related podcasts that are influential in our niche that, we at SparkToro, we are not an SEO tool. We're not an SEO resource. That's not what we do. So it's interesting to see that we still have a lot of SEO influence. I guess not surprising, right?
Yeah.
Rand Fishkin had previously founded Moz, but it's a good clue for us to understand, like, okay, these are still really influential podcasts or content platforms in our niche that maybe we ought to consider pitching ourselves on some of these shows. Or maybe if we really want to do an about face on SEO, then we don't go on these shows. But yeah.
What's an area you're still working on, even as long as you've been at SparkToro with audience research? Like, what's your biggest weakness that you're still trying to figure out?
I think the thing we're really trying to crack still, and I think it's pretty common for most B2B SaaS companies, is infusing delight throughout the product experience to really drive retention, right? Like, we've done things like we've completely revamped our onboarding sequence. We've reduced number of steps in our onboarding tour, increased retention, and we've also increased our free to pay conversions on SparkToro accounts, which is great. But we're still looking to do more of this, right? Make it better. We're trying to increase awareness of our Reddit data, right? Or increase the value or decrease the time to value realization on some of these features, right? Getting people to more quickly feel like, oh, I didn't know I could do that in SparkToro. Like, oh, I got to do this again. Or, those things that really get people to stay. We're always thinking about stuff like that.
That's awesome. Because that's really why I wanted to bring you on, because I was aware of SparkToro. I knew you went over there and I had played with it a little bit. And then, we've had just more and more customers where they're trying to lean on us a little bit more to find that unique, I guess, value proposition for their podcast and how to make it different versus just, going forward with a boilerplate strategy. So, and we wanted to pull in research to do that. So I was just committed to trying to figure out how does SparkToro fit into that. And in Rand's blog post where he basically wrote it in response to an email, which is really cool, that I'll reference in the show notes, where he basically responded to a customer's email with my exact question, like, how can I use it to help drive podcast strategy or, some serialized type content? It could work for a video series or webinars, what have you. And I think that really helped connect the dots for me a little bit. And we started to look at it even further. So, maybe you did some research there and you were able to fill in a gap for one of your customers. It worked for me. So I appreciate you, walking through everything here today. This will help us at Motion, and then also our customers who might be trying to still figure out what that strategy is before they actually launch the show that they're working on. So Amanda, I know you have a lot going on. Where can people go to find out more about you and maybe I know you have an event, Spark Together, right? Is coming up soon. So fill us in on that stuff.
Yeah. So maybe we'll start with Spark Together if this is applicable to your audience. Spark Together is our first virtual summit. It is on November 10th. And it is, I think, the first story-focused marketing event. So we're having each of our speakers tell a story that was a career-defining moment for them. And each speaker is going to reveal some confidential details, and the event will be not recorded. So you have to come live and be part of the full experience. And then as far as whatever else we do at SparkToro, SparkToro.com, we are the makers of audience research tools. And for myself, you can find me on Twitter at Amanda Nat, and my personal site and newsletter is at amandanat.com.
You're always releasing good material there, and that's where I got the cocktail ideas. So I might have to hit you up on a DM to get that recipe when it's all said and done. So, well, man, it was great connecting with you today. We'll stay in touch, and thanks for joining me on Recorded Content.
Yeah, thanks, Tristan. This was fun.
Thanks for listening to Recorded Content, a show brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcasting agency for B2B tech marketers. We do the podcast stuff so you can focus on strategy, building brand awareness, and developing new relationships. To learn more about how you can launch and grow a podcast for your company, check out motionagency.io. Thanks for listening to Recorded Content.